Hine tsava baitz nore ore Imne ore yev huise nore Yes I'd kan apsosus haskatsa U երբ արմատներիս վերադարձա Ինձ գտաշե
So the reason we've all come here today is to hear this incredible orator and someone who connects it all, connects everything you've been hearing to our lives today, and that's Bishop Daniel Findikyan. Bishop Daniel is the director of postgraduate studies at the Gevorgyan Seminary. Currently, that's his position. He's been a professor at St. ADRESS, the Armenian Seminary back east. He served as primate of the Eastern Diocese. And I think if you were going to ask me something, it just all came together last night about him. A young man approached him. We were sitting in the lobby of the hotel, and a young man approached. And a lot of people approached, without any disrespect to any of you who did approach him. He cordially said hello to all of you. But when this young man approached, and he said that I'm thinking of attending St. ADRESS, Bishop Daniel lit up. I was right across from him. It was like a light bulb. And he started engaging in him and everything. I think that's the person you are. You're somebody who has invited generations to this beautiful church of ours. And to have him in our midst is a blessing. We were very fortunate last year. It was in April that we contacted him through Hovnansa Bazan, and immediately he said it would be an honor to be there and to be with us. And I've got to tell you, it was a little bit sketchy over the last weeks, especially last Saturday when they started the war in Iran. But as he tells it just, when he got to Paris, they had already closed up Yettem airport. So that airspace, so that's how close it was. But I believe it's God's hand in this whole thing to bring him here today to hear this message. So without any further ado, there was a further ado, I forgot it. He wrote this book, Building Up the Body of Christ, and I have like 3 or 4 copies left with me today. If you beg and maybe do me favors, I'll be happy to give you a copy. But I recommend, if you read nothing else in your life, seriously, I'm being serious, as a worker in the church, as somebody who cares about the Armenian church, if you read nothing else, read this. It's a small little essay about where we are as the Armenian church here in America. But I'm very happy to tell you, we talked yesterday about reprinting this. So within the next few months, we should have a second edition of this. But it is online. You can read it online if you so choose to do. And we'll make sure that we get a link out to you. But Building Up the Body of Christ is his vision for the Armenian church here in America. And with that, Sir, it's yours.
Nice words. Gevorgyan, I'm looking around. Who is this person? Who is this person you're talking about? I don't know. I'm not so sure. But thank you very much. I want to say a couple of words of gratitude. First of all, to Hovnansa Bazan, who once again, as he's done many times in the past, welcomed me with open arms and warmth, and organized a big luncheon and invited the clergy. I've known him for 40 years, since he was a young opera in Canada, and he's been an inspiration to me for all those years. His openness to new ideas and trying things, and sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding tremendously. I'm very, very grateful to him, and of course we all remember him in our prayers today, his soul of his brother who passed away. Gevorgyan, what can I say? I could say the same things in many ways. We go back a long time, and we've had all kinds of incredible discussions and analyses and prayer and thoughts, and our hearts are on the same page in many ways with regard to the love of God and the love of our church. Your whole team, I'm grateful to. The whole apostle team that puts this together and works really hard. I've seen that. I've been an eyewitness of the work that goes into putting something like this together. So your invitation to me this year, I believe I was a speaker at the first Reclaim. I believe I was. And so to be back on the 10th is an enormous honor, an enormous privilege. So thank you to you, Dervaskin, for all the good work you do and the countless lives that you and your co-workers, ministers, have touched. Gevorgyan Pardeus Naev im Horinshoragarutunis Yev Urahutunis Gaide Miskapes. Shad Adaptevo is Haitigurinam, Hosarimedian Temin Meche Kutbevelu. But every time I'm here, I'm very happy to see my brothers in Christ who are here today. Especially my dear Father George, who here in the West is known as their Kevork, whose original name is Father George, whether you know that or not. Their Kevork was my really first pastor, far away in Binghamton, New York, St. Gregory the Illuminator, a church that has a history very different from this one, from St. Mary Yettem, but has also a very noble history and small size. It's amazing what comes out of little small Armenian parishes in America. Father George did not baptize me, but he lit a fire within me that paved the way for the few things I've been able to accomplish in this life, and ultimately becoming a bishop of the church. So thank you, Derek Kevork. It's special always to see you, and yet it's been stand right here as well. And to be standing here in Yettem is an enormous honor as well. So reclaiming monasticism for the Armenian church today, question mark. Monasticism is a daunting word. Let's get that out there from the start. I think there are some people that are not here today because the title of this day uses the word monasticism. When most people hear the word monasticism, they probably picture a dark medieval scene from novels and films that we've seen, hooded old men in heavy robes, stooped, old men shuffling along in their sandals down long, shadowy stone corridors, the slow, haunting drone of Gregorian chant echoing in the background. You might think of Sean Connery in the film adaptation of Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose, a film that if you haven't seen, you should see it. But you should get that out of your mind as far as the next little while that we'll be talking together. I think a lot of people think in those terms when they hear that word monasticism or monk. For us gathered here in Yettem today, however, I believe that monasticism might not quite be as mysterious and alien as others might imagine. Why is that? I think when Armenians think of monasticism, their minds go in a different direction toward, I would bet, the ubiquitous ruined monasteries that dot the Armenian landscape. Massive tufa structures, the monoliths that rise from the earth, the pointed Kumpet domes like we have right above us here that peak above the horizon at nearly every turn in modern Armenia or historical Armenia. The khachkars, the cross stones with their centuries-old scarred inscriptions, and the exquisitely carved blocks of masonry that scatter across the Armenian countryside. I think that's where a lot of us go when we Armenians think and hear the word monastery or monasticism. These monuments punctuate the historic homeland of our people, but they appear far beyond it as well. In Persia, in Jerusalem, in Constantinople and Crimea, and as far away as Venice and Egypt and Ethiopia and India, and even, once upon a time, reaching to Ireland, Iceland, Kyrgyzstan. Did you know that there were Armenian monasteries once upon a time as far away as that, east and west? That says something about who we are. In the mid-20th century, the Mukhtarist monk from Vienna, Father Hamazas Voskian, He published a series of 14 volumes cataloging more than 600 Armenian monastic foundations across the various regions of historic Armenia and Cilicia, based on literary sources, and especially based on colophons. What are colophons? These are autographed, kind of like postscripts, right? You write a letter and there's a PS at the bottom. These are PSs appended to manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts over the centuries, in which scribes gave thanks to God for allowing them to bring these massive written works to completion, sometimes at the cost of these scribes' eyesight. Some of them became blind because they're copying thousands of pages, right, by candlelight, not with a laptop. And in these colophons, they also often frequently identified their home monastery. The scribes were monks. They named their patron, so someone paid money for a copy, for a scribe in a monastery to maybe copy a Bible or copy St. Gregory of Nardic's Book of Prayers or other things. And often significantly, they recorded the date and other historical circumstances of their times. Most of these colophons are known mostly to scholars, but Voskian's inventory represents a really striking testimony to the importance of monastic life in Armenian society and religion, even if his list of monasteries, numbering over 600, is incomplete. In more recent decades, the French art historians Michel and Nicole Thierry elaborated on the work of Voskian and others, and they compiled a catalog of over 1,000 Armenian monasteries, many of which those two scholars, husband and wife, visited themselves. By the way, non-Armenian husband and wife. Somehow interested in Armenian monasteries. Go ask them. To those registered, we should also add the work of an archbishop named Mugrdich Alavnuni, who in 1931 compiled yet another list of Armenian monasteries and churches, this time limited to the Holy Land. Roughly 70 monasteries, churches, hermitages, and pilgrimage sites located throughout Jerusalem and its environs. The Mount of Olives in Bethlehem and the Judean desert, Galilee, the Transjordan, Sinai, and the pilgrimage routes through the Negev desert that led to St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt at the foot of Mount Sinai, and that monastery itself, St. Catherine's, is itself one of the oldest continuously operating monasteries in the world. By the way, I don't know if you realize that the oldest examples of Mesrog Mashel's alphabet anywhere are not in Armenia. They're carved onto stones in the early 5th century by probably disciples of St. Mesrog, who might have had a part in creating that alphabet, in the Negev desert on these pilgrimage routes where Armenians were traveling to the pilgrimage site of Mount Sinai. That's where you have to go if you want to see the oldest remaining Armenian writings. So, Der Voskian, if we haven't already, one day we need to reclaim the early and continuous witness of Armenian Christianity in the Holy Land. Have we done this? I don't think so. Something to think about. In any case, for roughly the last century, this is where I'm going with all this, the study of monasticism, Armenian monasticism, has been dominated by the investigation of its buildings, chiefly led by historians of art and architecture. I can list the names, I have them written here. Josef Strzygowski, Toros Toromanyan, Catholicos Karakin-Hovsepians, Alexander Shahinyan, and on and on and on. There's a dozen or 15 of them here who, throughout the, let's say, late 19th to 21st century, really, have taught us a great deal about the construction of Armenian monasteries, their structural systems, what held them together, distinctive architectural forms like the kumpet, building techniques, sculpture, and artistic decoration of all of these monastic buildings. You could fill entire bookshelves with the works of these scholars. Of course, these buildings, these monastic buildings, really have to be counted as among the great jewels of Armenian culture. But for all their beauty and art historical significance, two things have been overlooked by scholars in recent centuries when they've looked at Armenian monasteries. Number one, We have to remember that the vast majority of surviving monastic structures are churches and chapels, whereas Armenian monasteries originally included all kinds of other buildings, such as living quarters, dormitories, refectories, libraries, and classrooms. By and large, those ancillary structures have not survived. They've disappeared without a trace, probably because they were not constructed with the same concern for permanence and durability as the sanctuaries were, or maybe because the people that raided these monasteries in earlier times might have been a little bit more reluctant to completely obliterate sacred buildings than other kinds of buildings that were part of the monastic grounds. So when we go to Armenia, we visit monasteries. We generally see churches with domes either standing or in ruins. We don't tend to see, except with a few exceptions, libraries and classrooms and all kinds of other buildings. So that's important to keep in mind when we think monastery. Second, and much more important, the mere profusion and beauty of our monastic churches has often distracted us, ironically, from the plain truth that these buildings were once occupied by human beings, and very extraordinary human beings at that. Armenia's monasteries were once bustling centers of art and prayer and learning. And this is really the main distinguishing feature that distinguishes Armenian monasticism from other Eastern and Western forms and traditions, monastic traditions. And that is Armenian monasticism's profoundly intellectual and academic character. The head of an Armenian monastery, traditionally, is of course the abbot, the appahai, right? Appahai, which means, it comes from the Aramaic word for father, or daddy, actually, appa, abba. But the abbot bore that title not only in Armenia by reason of his seniority, his spiritual wisdom, but because he was a vartabe, a learned teacher or doctor of the church. Vartabe is an ecclesiastical rank that exists only in Armenian Christianity and nowhere else. Vartabeds studied theology, Bible of course, but they also studied theology, canon law, philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, music, geography, history, and all kinds of other things. So theology in the old monastic mindset is not just what we understand theology to be today. It was a huge, broad focus. How does God fit into this world? Right? Those planets out there were created by God. That makes astronomy a theological discipline, as well as a whole lot of other things. So Armenian monasteries were schools in two different senses. One, they were schools in the practical sense. Students went there to study and learn. And they were schools in the intellectual sense, where distinctive theological traditions, ways of doing theology, ways of thinking developed and were transmitted from generation to generation. Recently, scholars have begun to examine this. How were the graduates of the monastery of Galadzor, for example, in kind of southern Armenia, how was their training different than the graduates of the monastery called Garmir Vank, the Red Monastery of the Mother of God, on the Black Mountain just outside of Cilicia, a little bit later. That's where St. Nerses Shorali came from. These are two different schools of theology. They were trained differently. And when scholars read their writings, there are relatively few scholars that are able to do that, but when they do, they come up with a whole kind of a palette, a whole understanding of the diversity and the breadth and the depth of how Armenians lived the Christian life and understood God and interpreted the Bible. Right? All that is really, really interesting. Very good. I'm skipping around here a little bit. So, even if they were intellectual centers, our monasteries also functioned as centers of agricultural innovation, right? Agricultural innovation. I wouldn't be surprised if the ancestors of some of the farmers that cultivated these lands here 100 and some years ago, their ancestors may well have been trained and learned in monasteries, because that was where agricultural innovation came about, in monasteries. They were also centers of medical care, artistic production, and all kinds of other things. They hosted pilgrims. They mediated disputes. In a spirit of fraternal, maybe sometimes heated rivalry, the monasteries vied to influence the policy and direction of the Armenian church by advocating for their own alumni to become future bishops, right? If I'm the abbot of a monastery, I've trained my students, I want my students to become Vartabeds and then to be the bishops, and maybe even one day Catholicos, so that they can bring what they've learned to the benefit of the church. So, such an environment of vigorous ideological exchange and spiritual cross-fertilization, in the end, really benefited the leadership of the church in former times. So really, the monasteries were the engines of Armenian life and civilization. This leads us to the second major distinctive feature of Armenian monasticism. Contrary to the common caricature, which we're trying to dispose of here, most monasteries in Armenia were not remote hideaways for eccentric hermits who were kind of severed themselves from the outside world. No, that's in movies. That's not, by and large, Armenian. By and large, many Armenian monks were part of the daily life of their surrounding communities. In general, the approach of Armenian monasticism was not to withdraw from everyday life, but to embrace it. Not all, but many monasteries were situated near villages. The Vartabeds preached in nearby parish churches. They welcomed pilgrims and visitors. They offered spiritual direction. They heard confessions. They taught young people. They consoled the forlorn. They prayed with soldiers. They advised civil rulers. They welcomed villagers to worship with them in their churches. Until recent centuries, monasteries functioned variously as Armenia's universities, libraries, music conservatories, counseling centers, art studios, scriptoria, that is the manuscript era equivalent of publishing houses, hospitals, workshops, cemeteries, and hostels. Until modern times, most Armenians lived within easy travel distance of one or more monasteries. Ordinary people interacted with the Vartabeds. They knew them. They trusted them. They learned from them. They prayed with them. They worked alongside them, sometimes in the fields. That closeness between clergy and faithful reinforced the conviction that God is part of the nuts and bolts of this life. Not merely an abstract philosophy or distant hope for some imagined future entrusted to an elite sacred caste. To this day, some of you have done this. You go to a village in Armenia, the folks in the village will probably very happily and proudly take you up to the local monastery. This is our monastery, they'll say. And they'll tell you all about the history and the saints that emerged from that monastery and the miracles associated with it. And they may take you, I've done this, they'll take you on a walk or maybe a brisk hike, maybe a short drive to their monastery. This is our monastery. And that becomes a kind of a mini pilgrimage. And that's an honor to the visitors, and it's an honor to the villagers, whose life was in many ways shaped by that sacred place. Even monasteries that are just reduced to ruins today, if you go there, you'll find very often, you'll stumble upon these places, you'll find little candles flickering. Someone went and lit a candle and left it there and they prayed. Sometimes you'll find little holy cards and icons and little tokens and things that have been, shoved into the cracks between the stones. And these are little tokens of prayers that went answered. And they stand as witness testimony to real enduring devotion. That's monastic life in Armenia. As far as the monks are concerned, their regular contact with the community ensured that their feet remained rooted squarely in the real world. Even when monasteries were intentionally located far from villages and cities to allow for the monks to sort of have their peaceful, uninterrupted prayer lives, Armenian monks remained closely engaged with the surrounding communities. This kept them grounded in the practical reality of daily life, rather than to kind of be lost in abstract theology and whatever else we imagine they might have done. Things that probably had little relevance with the real matters of families, raising their children, working, fighting off, marauders, and what so many of our ancestors had to do for many, many generations and his centuries of Armenian history. So there's a symbiotic relationship here between the monks and the people. And that's one of the characteristic features of Armenian monasticism. We don't find that very often in, for example, Greek monasticism, or Russian monasticism, or even Syriac monasticism, or the monasticism of Egypt in the desert. This is something very Armenian, and we need to be thinking about that. We need to be aware of that. Armenian monks depended on community support, and the community depended upon the monks for spiritual leadership, education, mediation, and care. Hopefully you're following where I'm going with all this. This is a distant world. We don't live in that world anymore. And I'm leading you to the realization that that could be a problem for us. All right, I'm going to skip a section here because monastery, even that word, we've got to be a little bit careful. Monastery comes from monos in Greek, which means one, solitary, alone. That's one kind of monasticism. That's not overwhelmingly Armenian monasticism. Armenian monasticism was in community. So you had people, men and women, there were women monasteries as well, that sort of, in a way, they left sort of work in the villages, in the cities, and so they did withdraw to a certain extent, but they lived in communities. And they had time to go off on their own and pray, but they always came back together, to be together. And Armenian history always frequently mentions those kinds of communities. Okay. So, simply put, the Armenian church was her monasteries. The people believed in God and worshiped God under the guidance of monks. Monks were everywhere. They were out there. You didn't have to go look for them. They were there. Right? The way the parish priest is here, he's there. The deacons are here, they're around. Right? We see them. We run into them. We get together on occasions like this. That was the case until very recent times. That was the experience of the Armenian church for most Armenians, until recently. It's among the oldest ones in the United States that were built over 100 years ago, right? Where the Armenians have moved away, and now there's not much left. And it's becoming harder and harder to hold things together, economically and otherwise. But there's no way we're going to sell those churches. Not a church like Holy Cross. Not like some other churches that I've visited in the past. No way. These have to be transformed and transitioned into other kinds of communities that can be a benefit to our people and to the people around us and to God's glory. One other idea, and I've got like 2 minutes left, so we're going to be okay here. You're going to survive me. Although I have 7 minutes, I think, right? Okay. Well, so I mentioned this idea. By the way, when I mentioned this to the parish council at Holy Cross, one man in his 80s started crying. I said, that's what we need. How do we make this happen? And I pray that it will happen. I pray that that will happen. Because that's what has to happen. Well, if you're a monk living in the middle of the Dominican ghetto, that's kind of hard too. You want to get out a little bit. We have a camp at St. Mary's in New York, in the Eastern Diocese. It's up in the Catskills. Some of you have been there. It's nothing like your camp. I can't say that too much. Your camp. Our camp is humble. It's nice. It's very different. It's a different feel, different feeling. Lots of property. It's sort of removed, but it's not in the wilderness. And we had some benefactors that said, we need a camp. We need to purchase a camp. It can also serve as a conference center. And they put some money together and they purchased this wonderful facility. Unfortunately, it still needs some work. It's not winterized. So we can only use it for 1/5 or 1/6 of the year. The rest of the time it's empty. And there's an enormous amount of land. And summer is packed with kids, and they love it, and they make friends, and they date, and they get married, and they make children, and some of them come to seminary, and it's great. It's just a place to cultivate Armenian Christian life. So I thought, why don't we build a monastery there? Why don't we build a nice Armenian chapel? There's already dormitories. And let's get a few monks, let's get a few men, maybe a few women, I don't know, and plant them there. And maybe they travel back and forth when it gets real hot in the summer in Holy Cross and in Dominican ghetto. You come up to the mountains and you relax there. And you help with the camps. And you organize retreats. And you live a sort of a double, you have two headquarters. And maybe those eventually become 2 monasteries. Who knows? All of these kinds of things are possible and very much doable. And these are 2 real ideas that could be accomplished just with a little bit of vision and then with some people that have better administrative qualities and skills than I have. But those people are all around us. Let me close with this. Reclaiming monasticism means reclaiming seriousness about Christ. Not as merely one ingredient of national identity, but as disciplined, communal, joyful commitment. The question before us today is not whether we can reproduce the past exactly. You can't. The question is whether we have the vision and the courage to revive it, retrieve it, reclaim it at its core. If we do, monasticism will not be a relic on a hill. It will once again become what it always was, the beating heart of Armenian Christian life. And perhaps, in a post-Christian but searching America, that heart may begin to beat strongly again. Let that be our prayer. Thank you all.
Thank you. Incredible. We are going to have questions and answers together for all of them. Okay, it's going to be afterwards. I know there's a lot of comments, questions that people want to make. So after our next 2 presentations, we're going to have a combined Q&A session. And Ivana, would you stand up? She's going to lead it. If during lunchtime or something you have a question, maybe you don't feel like standing up, please put it on paper and give it to her, and she'll be happy to share it during that Q&A session. So at that time, we'll have all of the speakers here, and you'll be able to ask them. I want to just take one moment because I forgot the good-looking priest, Father Gevorgyan. I forgot to say welcome. He is the priest of St. in Reedley, California. And we also have with us Father Gomidas, who is in the back, and he's the priest of St. Gregory Fowler. It takes me a while to remember all these little places here, which are huge places in their own right. Anyway, thank you very much for everyone for being here. What we're going to be doing is we're going to have a picture first, group picture, and Vlad is going to take it. So as we leave, he will lead us to where he wants to take that picture. And one other thing, when Sirpazan said about one day you need to have one about reclaim the Holy Lands and everything, it occurred to me that during those 10 years that we've been doing it, one reclaim was the reclaim Etchmiadzin as the center of Armenian Christianity. We had to call it off because it was the first week that COVID was announced. And we hadn't made any, and so the next 2 ones we actually did by Zoom, the 2. But that one that we called off, I want to take this chance because I wanted to recognize her at that time. One of the speakers for Etchmiadzin was going to be Gaudiya Armenian, and she's with us today. Back then, I had to call you and say it's off. It was a horrible call. But anyway, thank you for being with us today. So, with that, we're going to go out. Vahe will call the shots, and then we will go to the hall where the Circle of Faith, Circle of Love are going to be sharing their beautiful lunch with us.